Hi, this is Asa, co-founder of Gameondaily, with another Technalysis video. This one is about Insomniac's Spider-Man games and how they look and perform on the PlayStation 5. So for background, Spider-Man released for the PlayStation 4 in 2018. Miles Morales has only just come out a couple of months ago. It's essentially a standalone expansion pack to that Spider-Man 2018. It takes place several months after the first game. It gives New York a layer of ice and snow, and it gives Miles a stint as the protagonist. But it's very much a continuation of the 2018 game in terms of technology. The release of Miles Morales, though, it coincided with the launch of the PlayStation 5, and the game got positioned as something of a flagship title for the console, with enhanced graphics and performance, most notably ray tracing. Insomniac also retrofitted those enhancements to the 2018 version of the game and touched up some of the art, and that's Spider-Man Remastered. So we've got Spider-Man Remastered and Spider-Man Miles Morales running the same technologies and the same performance profiles, and this video covers them both as one. If you follow our other content, you might already know that I personally adore these games, but that's not really the point. The point of this video is more to look into the specific technologies, the performance profiles that are available, and whether they're hitting their targets, how we should be playing this. But before we do that, public service announcement, this applies regardless of what mode you're looking at. Delve into the menu and turn off film grain. So if you're looking on a mobile, you probably can't see the difference here, but if you are watching on a big screen or playing the game yourself, film grain essentially takes a really nice looking game and smears crap over the screen, so just get rid of it. It's also definitely not exclusive to Spider-Man, so film grain is in loads of games, and I'll always recommend just turning it off. Okay, so let's take a look at the visual profiles that you get to choose from in these games. So we're looking at what you get and what you have to compromise to get it. Fidelity mode is the default, and it is the only mode that runs at 30 frames per second, so that's the big compromise there. But the in-game description says that you get ray tracing, enhanced lighting, additional visual effects, and an extra high quality picture from a 4K resolution base. So the only compromise here is that 30 frames per second mode, and that's potentially a big compromise. We'll talk more about that later. But it does mean that we can use this profile as our kind of benchmark. It's got no other compromises. So when we're looking at the other modes, this is what we'll be comparing them against. Next up, we have the performance mode. So performance mode brings 60 frames per second to the table, which means it's prioritizing smoothness and responsive gameplay. Which sounds great, but compromises that you make for it. The biggest one is no ray tracing. You also lose the enhanced lighting and the additional visual effects that were mentioned in the previous profile. And the resolution description says that it provides a 4K picture from a lower resolution base. So it's got, it says temporal techniques, but effectively it is upscaling that lower resolution base. And rather than look into numbers here, the best way to go about this is to look on screen and see the results, because it is actually a very clean image. For me, when I look at this scene, I'd be pretty hard pressed to spot the difference in lighting and visual effects and even the resolution without a direct side-by-side comparison. But the ray tracing really does jump out, and it is pretty hard to miss the difference on this building on the right. The last profile to look at is one that came post-launch. So this is Insomniac's answer to fan demands from people that didn't want to compromise 60 frames per second and didn't want to lose ray tracing. And they have delivered both here, but what you lose is a more significant reduction in screen resolution. You lose out on the reflection quality, so the ray tracing that is there is at a lower resolution again, and it's a lot more noisy, and you get a fairly significant reduction to the pedestrian count. For me, the compromises are more apparent in this mode. So the lower resolution is more noticeable. I start seeing stair steps in the straight lines. The quality of that ray tracing, it's great that the ray tracing is back, but it does look a bit noisy, and the pedestrian count is really noticeably thinner. I say for me, we all perceive things differently. That's why these videos are uploaded at such high quality, so you can get your eyes on and you can see for yourself what you think of it. If you've got the game at home and you've got the console at home, you can obviously do these side-by-side comparison to your heart's content as well. The game is fairly difficult for direct comparisons because each profile change does require a restart and a reload back to your previous checkpoint. So for your convenience, let's take a look at some of this side-by-side. One compromise that you have to accept in all three modes is the change to Peter Parker. So the old Peter Parker has gone. It is just the face actor that's gone. They've changed the model. The voice acting is all the same, so there's no question of performance or quality in that sense. But it is a little bit jarring to see the new Pete. Nonetheless, this scene does give us a nice opportunity to take a look at these more subtle differences in visual effects and lighting. And when I say subtle, the changes are so subtle that I've moved the performance labels to the bottom of the scene, because the most noticeable difference here to me is the way that the light is hitting Peter Parker's hair. But I think it's fair to say that cutscenes probably shouldn't be the determining factor in what profile you choose to use. And that kind of brings us nicely onto gameplay. So the next section is going to be swinging around the city so that we can check the performance, make sure that each of these three profiles is hitting their targets. But while this is playing, just bear in mind the differences that we've already spoken about. So take a look at, in particular, the ray tracing as you swing around the city, but any of the other effects that we've mentioned, the resolution and such as well. I'm just going to show the fidelity mode and the performance mode side by side for a little bit, so that you can pay particular attention to the difference in frame rate. So there's a massive difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. But at 30, Insomniac have done every trick in the book to make it look smooth in terms of motion blur and in terms of clever camera work. And it's pretty good, but look for yourself and see how stark that difference is to you. And on the flip side of that, while the performance mode is up and running, pay close attention to the reflections on the buildings there, because we haven't got ray tracing in this mode, but the tricks that are in place, the cube matte reflections that they are using, are pretty convincing as you swing by. You can also see both fidelity mode and performance mode have pretty good locks on their target frame rates. So let's just have a quick look at that performance ray tracing mode, so that third mode that tries to take the best of both worlds. And yeah, you can see it's a locked 60 as well, so swinging through the city is no problem for any of those modes. They all do exactly as much as they promised to do. Okay, so that's enough swinging around. Let's take it to one of the early missions in Miles Morales. The missions quite often take you to really nicely designed interior locations, so it's quite a different visual aesthetic to swinging around the city, and this one's no exception. This room actually highlights something that's worth looking out for, because the ray tracing modes have really prominent reflections on the floor, and it looks kind of like a frosted mirror, whereas the screen space reflections in the performance mode, it may be less technically demanding, but I'd actually say it looks better. It's more convincing as a floor. This room actually highlights something that's worth looking out for, because the ray tracing modes have really prominent reflections on the floor, and it looks kind of like a frosted mirror, whereas the screen space reflections in the performance mode, it may be less technically demanding, but I'd actually say it looks better. It's more convincing as a floor. Okay, so I'm going to let this section of the mission run through, not in its entirety, but this is going to chop and change between the three performance profiles, all tackling this area of the mission, so that we can do some direct comparisons on performance when things get hectic in combat. I'm not going to talk on it directly as it happens. I will say now just a quick summary on the performance of them that you'll see in the frame counters. All three modes do actually drop a frame every now and again, so it's not perfectly locked, but it's nothing that you'll feel. The performance is essentially hitting the targets that are promised and feels rock solid. So I'm going to move on and start talking about my kind of recommendations, how I choose to play. But before I do that, I do just have to ask, please, if you've enjoyed this video up to now, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. It would be great if you could tell some people where we are so maybe they can come and watch as well. Little gestures of support like that really do make a massive difference to us, so thank you for anybody that does. And yeah, so my recommendation, so you can obviously play this in any of the profiles that you want. They all deliver exactly what Insomniac are saying that they're going to deliver. So it really becomes a case of identifying which of these kind of compromises you can live with. There are no modes in there that have no compromises. If that was the case, we obviously wouldn't have an option at all. So it's a question, can you enjoy the game at 30 frames per second? Can you sacrifice ray tracing? Can you just take a hit to the overall kind of image fidelity? In this video, I'm trying to give you the information to make that decision rather than telling you what I think is best, but I will run through my own kind of preferences. It makes sense to do so. So by process of elimination, the one that I am least keen on is the newest mode, the performance ray tracing mode, and the reason for that is simply that the lower image fidelity, it detracts from the game just a little bit for me. So when you see shimmering edges and noisy reflections and things like that, it kind of draws my attention. I think what Insomniac are delivering in this performance ray tracing mode, bringing ray tracing and 60 frames per second together, is objectively really impressive, but it's not how I'm going to play the game. So then the decision effectively comes down to a choice between playing at 60 frames per second or playing with ray tracing. There are other subtle differences, but this is definitely the big one. So let's take a closer look at those two things. It's no kind of secret that ray traced reflections, and it is specifically reflection in this game, but ray traced reflections are really demanding and quite new within particularly the console gaming space. So let's just take a look at what Spider-Man does here. The ray tracing is used really extensively. There are a whole load of mirror-like surfaces throughout the world. Even Spider-Man's armor, in some cases, will reflect using ray tracing. So the ray tracing here definitely has limitations. All of the surfaces that are reflective are very reflective. There's very little in the way of kind of diffusion. No rough surfaces are reflecting. Everything's effectively a mirror. The reflections are at a 1080p resolution. They're a little bit noisy, and some of the models that are reflecting might be a little bit simplified. You won't get emittive light sources reflecting, you won't get shadows reflecting, you won't get alpha particles reflecting, and reflections only bounce once. So if you are looking at a reflection of a mirrored surface, you'll get a very plain view of it. Now, it might sound like I'm not impressed by the ray tracing here, but that's quite far from the truth. I'm pointing out the limitations, but they are sensible choices, and the payoff is reflections that reflect over a massive distance. So this is quite different from contemporaries like Watch Dogs Legion that have quite a limited range for their ray tracing. Spider-Man's reflections just stretch off into the distance, and combined with the amount of them that there are, it combines to really have quite a profound impact on the visual presentation of the game. Now, we've seen through the rest of the video that when you take away that ray tracing, the game still looks very, very good. Sometimes the screen space reflection can even look better. But overall, these measures definitely lack the punch that you get with the ray traced reflections. So, how important is the frame rate? So I'm going to show a cutscene here. Throughout the game, this opening cutscene from the first Spider-Man 2018 is the harshest example of the frame rate difference. Now, the screen that you're watching on will have its own motion handling, but if you're watching this on a typical TV with a gaming mode, that left screen judders along quite horribly. That's not so much the case when you get into the action, when motion blur and the kind of animations and camera work come together to give a much smoother presentation. Right, so I'm going to say something fairly wild and unexpected here. As a frame rate junkie that typically favours high frame rates over pretty much anything, I played this game at 30 frames per second. It might sound ridiculous, but the game actually lends itself to the frame rate quite nicely, because pretty much everything that you do in it is context sensitive. So it's all about timing of button inputs rather than fine-grained control. So I would say there's absolutely no detriment to playing at 60 frames per second. It's going to feel great at 60 frames per second, but it still feels great at 30 frames per second. And if you are shaking your head and hitting that dislike button right now, just remember, Insomniac agree with me, because the 30 frames per second mode is the default in the game. Let us know what you think. I'm Asa, this is Gameondaily. Thank you so much for watching.